From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and people like you who are making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Malathopoulos, Associate Professor of Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. Well, folks, we're deep into fall and we're as far away from pollination as you can get. But I'm here to tell you that this time of year is where the magic happens, especially when it comes to tree fruits. How you treat tree fruits at this time of year in terms of pruning and nutrition will really set things up for pollination later in the spring. To get at this question and kind of lay it out, not only in terms of how you treat the tree now, but also the setting up of the orchard and its importance to pollinators, I reached out to Mike Omeg. Mike is from Orchard View Cherries. I've worked with Mike a fair bit. He's been a strong champion of pollinators. In 2007, for example, he was the North American Pollinator Protection Campaign Pollinator Farmer Rancher Award winner. But he's also an entomologist. He's planted hedgerows. He's done all sorts of things for bees and pollinators, but he's also a top-notch cherry grower. So in this episode, we're going to hear from Mike his secrets to treating your trees and shrubs at this time of year to be able to get the maximum potential out of those plants when the bees arrive. All right, I'm here at Orchard View in the Dalles. Welcome to Pollination, Mike.
Happy to have you here today.
I've been wanting to do this podcast for a while. You're a very busy person. Maybe just one of the reasons you're busy is because you're in this prime cherry growing region. Maybe just to set things up, why the Dalles are such a good cherry growing region?
So the Dalles, we've had families here, such as my own and the Bailey family that are part of Orchard View. We farmed for multiple generations, over 100 years. This is actually Orchard View's 100th year in business. And my family's been farming here for 5 generations. My family and I live in my great-grandparents' house that they built. So it's pretty exciting. But the Dalles is a unique place. Most importantly, it's in the rain shadow of the Cascades, Mount Hood in this case. And so we get very little summer rainfall here. And that's critical for cherries because cherries are ripe in the summer. And if they get rained on, they crack open and they're not marketable. And so the first thing is we have really good weather. The next thing is we have excellent soils. We have wind-deposited silt loam soils that are just really superior. And we have water that's available mostly from the Columbia River here and from wells. And so you have good weather, good ground, and good water. And then you get people such as myself and then the employees that we have here. You get people with the skills to grow cherries and you're ready to rock and roll.
You know, I love that last part of the answer. All the conditions are right, but, you know, generations of building skills of growing cherries and that kind of the human labor aspect of just kind of, you know, pulling this all together. It requires a great amount of skill. And I guess that's where one of the things I wanted to ask you about today is oftentimes we think about pollination from the bee's perspective. You got to bring bees in, they transfer pollen to the stigma and all this. But I don't know if our listeners really consider how much work it is to get the right amount of flowers on a tree when the bees come. Can you talk a little bit about how, flower management? How do you get the right amount of flowers on a tree and, the work that goes into and the kind of work that goes into getting that bloom there ready when the bees arrive? Well,
from my perspective as a farmer, the moment of pollination is actually the last point. It's actually the last step of a culmination of events. Okay. Because if you can think about a cherry tree in a cherry year, when that bloom is pollinated, a lot of things that I and my team as farmers have done is we've set that up for success. And so the blooms that are pollinated in the spring, those actually begin to be developed on the tree in August of the previous year. And so the buds that are forming and developing on the tree are start in August. the tree goes through it's called bud differentiation, where it selects, is this bud going to have flowers in it, or is it going to grow a branch? That's determined in August of the previous year from bloom. Then how many blossoms rather, are within each bud is also determined. And a bud can have anywhere from 1 to usually 5 blooms, but with some of the more precocious varieties, we have 7 or 8 blossoms within each little bud. And those are just little mini versions, little mini suitcases of the following season's bloom are on the tree from August all through the winter, all through dormancy, and into the spring. And so one of the things that we practice in cherry farming is we have to prune our cherries. And that's all about balancing out how much fruit to how much canopy, how many leaves we have on the cherry tree. And a good part of that is we want to set X amount of cherries per tree. If we have too many cherries, the cherries are small and their quality isn't as good. And then if we prune off too many cherries, then we end up with not enough crop. And that's not a good thing either. And so we try to get that just right sweet spot as we're pruning the tree. But as a part of that, we have to be thinking about how many blooms do we want to have available to be pollinated for the bees. And if you say, well, we're going to have perfect pollination weather, well, we could prune heavier on our trees. But we oftentimes have no idea what the weather is going to be like the following spring when we're pruning. So we're pruning today, we're pruning right now here at Orchard View, and we're determining how many blossoms are going to be on that tree and available for those bees to pollinate. We have no idea what the weather is going to be like this coming April, here in many months. But because of our experience, because of our expertise, and because we have a history to fall back on, we have a pretty good idea of what it could be on average. But who knows what average is? So that's how we set up a pollination season. The bees are just the end of that process.
This is fascinating. I had never even thought about this, but sort of the key concept you brought was canopy to bloom, and sort of like making some kind of a calculation. So when a pruning crew goes out and they're looking at a tree, they're somehow figuring this out. They must. You come to a tree, you know exactly what you're going to do. I imagine after you do it a lot, you can figure it out. But it must be, to me, it just seems like a dizzying array of variables to work as you're out in the cold cutting branches.
Yeah. No, much of the work that we do here in tree fruits, it's skilled work. It's skilled labor. Number one is you have to have leaders that have good experience, good understanding of the impacts of pruning cuts on the crop the following season and also on future crops. It takes 3 years for a branch from the time it first develops on the tree to actually become a fruiting branch. Oh. So the first year it's just leaves. The second year it's also just leaves, and then the third year you have fruiting spurs where you set your crop. And so you're actually playing not checkers, you're playing chess, so to speak, and that you need to be looking ahead several seasons, because the impact that we're having in pruning right now impacts several seasons worth of fruit. And that takes experience, it takes skill and knowledge. A whole lot of art and science goes into that understanding. Then it's also about people, because you need a lot of people out there to do the pruning. If you can imagine, it's all done by hand. There's not giant machines that come through and cut our branches. And so those leaders that have that knowledge have to be skilled in conveying that knowledge to their pruning crews, the people that are working with them. And then they also have to be just really efficient at managing those people. So right now we have about 80 people out doing the actual pruning. And we have about 10 people supervising those 80 folks.
Wow, what an undertaking. And really impressive, though. I can just imagine it. It's not only chess, it's actually three-dimensional chess, so to speak. And then being able to cover all this area and have, the right level of skill on a crew. It just sounds amazing and incredible. So this work is done. And when does the pruning end? When's the last when does pruning seasons going from now until?
Yeah, so we'll start pruning generally in the beginning of September when there's still leaves on the tree. And then it really depends on the weather. Some years we can have a month worth of snow that's knee deep here or waist deep in the Dalles. Other years we can prune all through the winter because it's pretty mild. It just really depends on the weather. But generally what we go for is finishing up pruning at the end of March, which is usually when the buds are first starting to swell on our trees. And we want to absolutely be done before bloom, because if we're pruning during bloom or after bloom, that has negative impacts and unexpected impacts on the crop. So we need to have that done before the buds really swell and get open and bloom occurs.
I've always been amazed when the bees arrive in the Dalles. It's a really different system. I'm used to in other cropping systems where the beekeeper comes and places the colonies. Here, there's just a whole lot of colonies brought into a holding area, and it's actually the growers that, if I'm right, that are responsible for placing. That must be a huge undertaking. Tell us a little bit about bees arriving. You're just finished pruning. Everybody's really tired, and then the bees arrive.
Yeah, so we have, we have very long relationships with the employees that work here on our team that help us with the pruning. We also have long relationships with our beekeepers. Having a stable and reliable beekeeper is central to the success of us here at Orchard View. It's a fundamental link in the chain that if it's broken, it's a disaster for us. And so we have a really great relationship with our beekeeper. We provide the staging area for our own bees and for the neighbors of ours that our beekeeper also works with. And essentially, what happens is I'll be in touch with our beekeeper. We work Dave White. We work really closely with Dave. I don't know how many thousands of colonies he has, but we ourselves use a few thousand colonies, and so he's got more than that. And his success is him being successful means we can be successful too. So that's why we want to really cooperate and facilitate him having success here and his team. So we have a big landing. When you go there, there's many hundreds of pallets of colonies at any given time at this landing site. It's just at the edge of the orchard growing area in the Dalles because we don't want to be we want to be able to move bees to all the orchards in the Dalles without worrying about them returning, the bees getting confused and returning to where they were. So it's convenient, it's flat and easy to get to. That also helps. But we will have a team here at Orchard View, the bee team, and they work long hours at night to put out all the colonies that we have. And so I will let Dave know how many colonies we want each night. We usually are placing bees here for 5 or 6 nights. And we have a big team and we gear up. And so Dave knows each night how many colonies I'm going to want that night. And then our teams have map books where it shows where I'd like to place those colonies. And that's how we do it. They go over and grab the colonies, and then we stage those colonies in our around our orchard so they can provide us with the pollination that we need.
Now, I recognize that the placement's complicated. There are different varieties. There's all sorts of conditions. But I did want to before getting into that, I just wanted to switch gears. The first time I came to the Dalles, I could see the fans going off, and I realized there's extreme cold. It can be really cold here, and it can get really hot. How does that affect? And these are decisions where things are already in bloom, colonies may be already placed, and you have probably very little management wiggle room left. But tell us just what happens when you look at the forecast and you have some cold weather or some really warm weather. What starts going through your mind?
So I always err on the side of having insurance, and I view having extra colonies in our orchards as insurance for those bad weather events. And so typically, I want to have between 1.5 colonies and 2 colonies on average per acre for every block that we farm. There's some areas that are trickier than others, where I'll go to 3 or 4 colonies on average per acre. And that's based upon my experience with the variety and the location. And again, it's a bit of the art that's involved in doing this. Weather that's really cold kills blossoms. And so that means that we need to have more of the blossoms pollinated, because when we're pollinating crops, the bees don't pollinate every cherry blossom out there, and every cherry doesn't make it that gets pollinated. That's just part of it. And it's highly site and variety and weather dependent, and a whole lot goes into it that nobody could answer where we're going to end up. But the other thing is, if it's too warm, the pollen dries out, and the bees don't have the opportunity to pollinate a blossom before the ovule has senesced in the bloom, or the pistils dried out, or the pollen's dry. And so we want to have a nice sweet spot of weather. In the last few years, that's become a big challenge, because our weather is not behaving as it has normally, historically, I should say. And so we've had a lot of really warm years during bloom. And a couple of years ago, we had 6 inches of snow on top of our colonies and our blooms. In fact, there were bees in the field, and I got my truck stuck in a snowdrift. That was unprecedented. But because of that, we are putting out more bees than we have historically. The other thing is, we have to do it right, because we can't really move colonies around once they're out there. It is what it is. And so that's why I always err on putting out extra bees. In the farming business, there's lumpers and there's splitters. And so in other words, there's folks that like to, almost on a grid quadrant, spread their pallets of bees around. Mm-hmm. And so they'll say, I want a colony of bees for every so many feet or every so many units of acres. And then there's lumpers that say, I'm going to put most of the bees in one spot, and they'll radiate out from that point. And of course, lumpers think they're right and splitters think they're right. I have to say that I used to be a splitter, but I've definitely become more of a lumper, because that allows me to get more colonies out there more efficiently during the time. And to be honest with you, just going out and walking the orchards during bloom, I did not observe that having colonies equally distributed throughout our blocks provided a benefit. I think there was a lot of labor that went into that. It was a lot cheaper for me, instead of spending money on labor, just to put a few more colonies per acre, per site, and call it good. And so that's what I do.
Okay, Mike the Lumper.
There you go.
I really like that approach as well, because I imagine, and I guess in cherry, it's not like beekeepers, it's such a quick bloom, they're never in their colony. So it's not, from the beekeeper's perspective, less driving around to spots. But it does allow you to find like prime spots to put the bees. I imagine some of your orchards between the fence line and the trees, there's not great spots, so you can really pick the prime spots for the bees.
Yeah, we focus on good sites. It's better to have a good site and have bees lumped in there, again, in my opinion, than it is to try to spread them out and maybe have them in some spots. So when I'm picking a good site, number one, it logistically has to be good. So that means it has to be accessible by our equipment, and it has to have a good landing area that we can put the colonies into.
Which is, I have to say, out here tough. I don't people quite realize the terrain that you're growing cherries on out here.
Yeah, we just within a couple of miles, we have several 1,000-foot change in elevation, and we have all variety of slope and aspect here in the Columbia River Gorge. That's a great blessing for us, because it gives us a chance to have a lot of timing and different microclimates to take advantage of us within a really restricted geography. At the same time, it means it's steep, and you got to be about half billy goat to be out and about here. Certainly driving a tractor on some of our hillsides. But so what I do is I choose areas that we can get to with our equipment. That's really important. And then I want an area that's going to receive morning sun, be out of the wind, and have a source of water nearby. If I have those 3 things, I really go for it. We also mow down to make sure that the colony entrances aren't obstructed by tall grass and weeds. We want to do everything that we can to make the foraging force of the bees be as high as it is. That means, having that sunlight hit those bees right first thing as sunrise happens, not having wind force the bees to have to work hard to distribute. They just won't distribute on ridge tops if it's, if they're located there, they just hunker down. And then to have water that's available to the colonies, especially if it gets warm.
That's fantastic. I want to round out the interview by thinking about how orchards are laid out. And there's two things that I wanted to pick up. One was pollinizers, which I'll get to. But the thing that I really love about Orchard View and the way that this orchard is managed is some of the experiments around, starting orchards from scratch and incorporating pollinator habitat in. So can you tell us a little bit about your cover crop strategy, which has been really innovative in the region? I know whenever I give talks on habitat, it's like one of the, I love to tell the story about what's going on here at Orchard View, but tell us a little bit about the cover crop system that you have with setting up new orchards. Maybe the way to set this up is, you go to California and they've got mustard growing between the rows and everybody thinks, well, the trick is, just grow flowers between rows. And what I really love about the system here at Orchard View is you've thought really deliberately and carefully about a cover crop system that really works with the whole system, and it works great. So tell us a little bit about this system.
So it's important to note that the cover cropping work that we do, it's not oriented towards honeybees. It's oriented towards all that other plethora of bees and other insects that are allies, pollinators, and otherwise to us in farming. And so everyone likes a win-win, and I'm one of those folks. I'm also a lumper, and I'm a win-winner, I guess. But when we're renewing fields, so when we're coming into an orchard that's become old and inefficient and needs replanted, that's a great opportunity for us to freshen that soil with cover crops. And there's innumerable numbers of species and blends that I could plant out there in those soils while that field lies fallow before we plant new trees into the field. But if I can have a win-win, if I can select species, and what we do is we select species here for us in our area, under our soils and our management, especially the brassicas, any number of them do really well for us. We put in species that benefit us, that future planting by freshening the soil, and then also provide habitat for pollinators and other insect allies that we have out there. And so when we're renewing a field, we take that field out and we have a blend. I call it the AK-47 blend of pollinator mixes. That's a really simple blend that is a tried and true. And we plant that, and if we irrigate it, it will come up. If we don't get irrigation on, it will come up. If it's a wet fall or whatever, we plant something that is a robust species that are guaranteed to generate a stand, no matter what kind of special treatment they get. There's a lot of pollinator species that we work with that are pretty delicate, and we aren't planting flower beds out there. We need something that can sort of be amongst the wolves of the weeds and the other environmental conditions that aren't ideal. So we've kind of selected a blend that does that, and it provides a habitat outside of our orchards that's not driven through, that is pretty much left untouched by us with our agronomic management that we do, pesticides and insecticides, fungicides, any of the management. It's left alone. And what I've noticed is that the bees just love to go to those areas, and they can build up and just be doing their own thing and be out when they're outside of our orchards. And I think that's a really big benefit for us. We tried doing the alleyway cropping, and because we make so many passes irrigating our crop and spraying and harvesting, those crops just get mashed down to the ground and get trampled, and you only end up with grasses, and those are of minimal benefit to pollinators in particular.
I have to say we have a forthcoming research paper coming up about the bee communities, and this has got to be one of the richest bee communities in an agricultural area I've ever seen. Really, the stewardship and all the things that are happening here are resulting in some of the craziest and most interesting bees I've ever seen in an agricultural system.
Well, I'm an entomologist by training too, so I'm a master's in entomology. I love bugs, and who doesn't love bees? Every single one of them is cute, in my opinion. But I want to add something besides the cover cropping. I think that is an added benefit. But the other thing that we do is we have unmanaged areas. They have the very endearing term of scabs, but we have hillsides and steep ground, as we've already talked about, that is we don't consider that arable land, and we also leave that alone. And there's a lot of mostly native species, but some, introduced species like vetch and that sort of thing that grows in those areas, balsam root, lupins. They're just a really great community in our oak savanna that's on the edges of our orchards, and we leave that alone. We just let it be. And I've seen other cropping areas where I think they've lost an opportunity. They maybe don't have as many acres of unfarmed land as we do, but everybody has roadsides and fence rows and edges and corners. And oftentimes farmers will just spray that down. It'll just be bare soil. And I think that's an opportunity lost. We've chosen not to do that. And that, I think, has a big impact upon our production system and certainly on the pollinator community as well.
I love it. I always just delight in coming into those oak areas, but also just into the orchards as well. It's a really a great system of biodiversity and farming, a real example in the state, but even across the nation. But you've also supplemented by using these cover crops and eventually you plant into them. And I think I wanted to conclude with just bringing cherry pollination all the way around is pollen compatibility. And so when replanting, there are some varieties that are self-compatible, some that require pollinizers. Pollinizer, I imagine, is wasted space, but you need it. Well, I guess we should have you tell the listeners what a pollinizer is, and tell us about these strategies of maximizing pollen compatibility without losing valuable acres to pollinizer species.
Yeah, so cherries and many other prunus species, cherries, apricots, peaches, plums, and prunes, and everything else in between, requires a pollinizer historically. There are self-fertile varieties where you can have two trees of the same variety and they will pollinate each other. Those were created by some mad science radiation type of work that was done in Britain, I think back in the 50s or something like that, when we didn't mind, radiating stuff. But that's a different deal. So you have to have two different varieties of cherries. And every variety of cherry is very different from the other. And so we've worked hard here to select pollinizers, select varieties that both have premium fresh market quality for our customers. So we have our pollinizer varieties are ones that somebody in the store buying our product will be just as happy as the other variety. So I actually don't say one is the pollinizer of the other. Historically, an orchard was planted and every other tree, every other row, or every third row was a pollinizer variety. And they were just left there or they were sold for juice or yogurt or something else. What I do now is I take two fresh varieties that are compatible and I plant just them in a pattern where there's typically 4 rows of one variety and 2 rows of the other, and they're compatible varieties. So I don't really have a pollinizer anymore. I just have 2 varieties that are compatible with each other that are out there. And that's been a big change because with a global marketplace and margins being tight and labor being at a premium, we really don't have time as growers to grow any cherry that's not worth the absolute maximum. Farming's tough, and so things change, and we've changed along with it.
All right, so to conclude, Tell us your favorite cherry variety and your favorite bee.
Oh gosh, I'm sorry, the European honeybee is still the favorite bee because without them, no matter how beautiful all those native bees are and how amazing they are, we aren't even close to being where we would be with just them available to us. We need that European honeybee. I love honey. I love beeswax candles. I love pollen as a supplement for myself, for my own diet. And so I love the honeybee. I just really like them. I think they're an ally to humankind and have always been and always will be, just kind of like dogs. Sorry, cat people. But my favorite cherry remains the Bing cherry.
Really?
It's a cherry that was developed here in Oregon many, many years ago. And it's the industry standard. And nothing yet, everything is new and shiny, but nothing yet has come to taste better than a really well-grown Bing to me. And I'm probably old school and date myself with that, but I'm standing by it.
Well, thanks so much for taking time to talk with us, and I'm looking forward to July 4th and getting some more Orchard View cherries on my table.
Hey, thanks for the opportunity to speak to the listeners of your podcast today.
Thank you so much for listening. Show notes with links from each episode are available at the website pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's a form at the website where you can pop in and say hello and give me feedback. If you want to support the show, remember to leave a rating on iTunes, Spotify, or whatever podcast mothership you use. And finally, if you have the means and you want to help support my lab's effort to document bee biodiversity in Oregon, visit OregonBeeAtlas.org and follow down to the donate button where you can make a tax-deductible donation to the Jerry and Judith Paul Native Pollinator Endowment. Every little bit helps. See you next episode.